So here we are continuing with Fest 3. Delighted to welcome Karen Brain, colleague, friend, and very much a supporter of what we do. And obviously Karen runs one of the IMS insurance schemes. And when we spoke about what Karen might talk about and present on this afternoon, we just went back to basics, really. Very important, we touched on reports in the earlier presentation, but Karen sees reports on, I'm sure, a daily basis. Karen sees things that go wrong in reports. And I've asked her just to give us sort of a 45, 50-minute overview of some of the things she's seen go wrong recently. I won't be naming anybody, but over to you, Karen.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you for inviting me to talk. Yes, we've seen a lot of varied and different types of claims come over the years, and Mike asked me to talk about things that go wrong in reports that really result in claims arising. So what I've done is pick a few of the interesting areas and the ones that tend to reoccur, resulting from things that, as I say, go wrong in reports, because normally the construction or the content of it. So on that point, I shall start and go through some of the areas that I hope you find of interest. Right, my first slide, obviously, please feel free to ask questions, either at the beginning or the end. Going too quickly. The first thing I just wanted to raise, because people always talk about the terms and conditions that are important, the contracts, and they are actually very important to have good terms and conditions. But terms and conditions are not the be all and end all, and quite often they are ones that are disputed anyway. So what we tend to find is that it's very rare that the terms and conditions ever stop a claim from well, A, arising, and B, being paid out. It normally comes down to the content of the report that's produced. So from our point of view, we believe that the focus should be more on the report writing and the skills and particularly the learning process, and obviously that's part of what the IMS provide in their training. So it's the content and the layout we find tends to be the cause of the problem, the content for various reasons. I can't go into all of them. So as I said, we've really picked some of the more recurring points in this discussion. And the other issue is how the report deals with the expectations of the clients. The expectation of the clients and money comes into this, obviously, are the main causes of most of the actions. And that is really what probably instigates the initial complaint. And then what we find is they then start to go through and pick to pieces the report in whatever areas they feel are necessary. And sometimes they go through the whole report, just trying to identify mistakes to try and say that the surveyor wasn't competent generally. So, as I said, I'm going to look at a few recurring themes that have caused claims over the years and how some changes within the report writing and generally from the beginning of the process I've added in because I think they're relevant to try and stop the claim from arising in the first place, or if you want to call it a disagreement. So the issues that I'm raising in this talk are applicable to the writing of any report. It's not just a survey of a vessel, it's anything from lawyers, any type of report that's been written for a third party. The interesting claims have arisen from not actually identifying the client and misunderstanding the client's instructions, which I'll go into in more detail in the next slide. And the client often misunderstanding the scope of the role of the surveyor, as many of them do, not understanding the differences between different engineers. So it's very important that the client does understand the scope of your role. As I said, failing to deal with client expectations, which again I'll go into more detail, and the content of the report and the after comments. This is a very interesting point. We've had a number of claims, not specifically from the report itself, but it's been the after comments in emails that have often driven the complaint. So identifying your client and misunderstanding client's instructions. People say, well, surely nothing can be more simple than knowing who your client is and understanding your client instructions. But over the years, the miscommunications still keep arising, and that has resulted in quite disastrous results in terms of claims and obviously the cost of the claims for individuals. And from that point of view, I'm just going to go through a couple of, well, one specific example, which I think has reoccurred a number of times from my experience, which comes from the fact frequently a surveyor receives a call from a third party, and frequently can be from a sales broker explaining that perhaps somebody wants to purchase one of their vessels, and they often know the surveyor quite well. And they often then give the name of person A, we'll call he or she, and the contact details to the surveyor. The surveyor then goes on to contact, we'll call him person A, by phone, and often follows up with an email. The obvious thing is to assume that the contact detail is the person who's purchasing the vessel, but that's not always the case. So in this example, the surveyor attends the site and meets with A, and there's a second person who is with A. But probably because it's human nature, often people don't ask who B is and why they're there. And this is often part of the problem, because frequently we've come across, when claims have arisen in these circumstances, A has been the husband and B is the wife, and B is actually purchasing the vessel. So A has become the agent. So in a number of cases, a few months later, we've had allegations received from B and that there's a problem with the vessel. And the surveyor says that his client was A, and he may have been talking to A and never actually transmitted the information to B, because he thinks he's actually talking to A, and he's then frequently not documented the conversations to A to prove that he's provided that information to them. I know this is also important when you're speaking on a one-to-one and you are speaking directly with your client, but it's more so when you're also dealing with somebody who becomes an agent. And in the circumstances then, B does actually have, in many circumstances, again depending on the contract, the right to sue, particularly if they have been at the survey or met the surveyor. It's then very difficult to say that they're not going to be relying on it, because there's also an obligation on the surveyor in most cases. Again, I'm caveating that depending on the contract details, to actually inquire as to who the other person is and what their involvement is. So the surveyor should always ask at the beginning who's purchasing the vessel, and also perhaps beyond that, and just to find out who's going to potentially be relying on the information and have interest in the vessel of some kind. And make it clear in the instructions when you're writing to whoever it is in this scenario, and also in the report, again, just to confirm who the client is and who's going to be relying on the information. I know a lot of contracts and reports do actually contain terms in the contracts, and also paragraphs that state quite clearly in reports who has instructed them and who can rely on the information. But it's always worth making it absolutely clear who that person is as an individual in your report, and who can't rely on your report. So the next area that we've come across is actually clients understanding the scope of your role. And this has come up more recently with COVID arising, and particularly with very large vessels where people can't travel. And so it's very important that your agreement with the person as to what your role is absolutely clear as to why they're engaging you and what you're going to be doing for them. So in this example, the surveyor is asked to look at a vessel by a client who is unable to view the vessel because of COVID, which is, I said, quite common now. So the surveyor is asked to comment on furnishings in the vessel. And we're talking about very large yachts here, things that come towards or are in the super yacht category. So the surveyor provides his report and the client purchases the vessel. And when he takes possession, I said he there or she, they complain about that the furnishings are not as described by the surveyor. The surveyor states that his role or scope was not to comment on the furnishings to the extent the client expected within its role. That's normally what we get back. And the argument then starts as to what the role was of the surveyor. And frequently, because the instructions and the report either do not cover completely that area as to what they're actually going to be undertaking, particularly with these surveys when the prospective client is unable to view the vessel. It should be made absolutely clear what you are doing for them and whether they should be getting somebody else perhaps potentially to undertake the role of checking things like the furnishings, whether they like the colours, etc. But this has come to fruition more frequently because of the problems with COVID. And they can be quite costly, particularly on expensive vessels. So do make sure that you have specifically worded exclusions in a contract and repeat any instructions that you have in the initial inquiry, and also make sure you repeat it again in the report, so it just prevents any future disagreement. So the failing to deal with client expectations. Clients seem to have very high expectations now, and also very varied ones. And it's always important at the beginning, again during the instructions and throughout the process and in your report, that you actually deal with the expectations and make sure that you've identified them, particularly at an early stage. What are they expecting from the vessel? Are they going to be using it out to sea? Is it going to be inland waterways? Are they going to take it on what parts of the Thames are they going to use it on? What are they going to use it for? Is it cost effective to do what they want to use it for? And most importantly, the main cause of any form of disagreement is normally financial, when they find that they do not have the money to either do what they want to do with it or any repairs, which again I'll go into in more detail. So particularly people nowadays with COVID are looking to have canal boats to live on, and they have no idea of the cost of maintaining such boats. And this has been something which has been probably more frequent over the last 12 months. As I said, we've come into COVID. They're expecting our old boats to be in perfect condition for years, and they frequently do not understand the requirements or the cost of maintaining such boats. And these boats are not cheap to maintain. Most people are buying on a very tight budget, and they really don't understand the implications of buying some of these old canal boats. And on top of that, canal boats are being sold. I'm going to use the word what I call tarted up, for sale in some cases, and it is making it very difficult for the surveyor to identify defects in these vessels, and particularly when their hulls are heavily coated, which I'm going to go on to. So when you write your report, make sure you consider the expectations of your client and address them in your report. If they're going to look to live on the vessel, it may not be just a canal boat, it could be a different type of vessel. They may be wishing to actually change the vessel to use it. Make sure that you address it. If you're going to deal with it, or if you're not going to be dealing with those issues, make it absolutely clear within your scope of engagement, and say if you're not going to give any comment on it, and why, and whether in some instances you'll need to refer them to considering other investigations that will deal with in more detail later, particularly ongoing costs of maintenance, which I can't stress enough, because the ongoing cost of maintenance is probably one of the biggest issues that gives rise to complaints. And again, it comes down to the fact that they're normally bought on budgets, and there is insufficient money to undertake the repairs, or the repairs actually cost more than the vessel itself. So let me just pop these up. It's the content of a report you need to consider. And some of these I've dealt with in previous talks, and I've had a lot of discussions with Mike and actually Paul, who's listening into this today, about the content of the actual report that's written. So we've already addressed the thing, know your client and know who you're dealing with. Are you dealing with, in essence, an agent? Are you dealing with the purchaser? And make sure it's perfectly clear. Again, the purpose of the report, make sure it's clear in the instructions and at the front of the report. And always make sure that what you have in your instructions marries up with what you're putting in your report in terms of what the purpose of the report is and your scope and role. And say quite clearly what you won't be commenting and why. You may refer to your terms and conditions, or it may be that there's a problem with access, and then you want to probably expand on those, which we'll go into a bit later if we have time. So the other issue is the procedures and the process that you undertook. Frequently, regarding the procedures that you undertake to do the checks, there isn't, and you probably in basic surveys would not include all the details of how you undertook your investigations in the report, but do keep the contemporaneous evidence of how you did it. It may be that you made a decision to test it every metre, half metre, or you changed your mind as to why you did it, and keep notes of it and dated as to what you did, because there may be too much information to put in the report as to how you completely undertook your survey. But keep everything, scan it in, and make sure the notes that you take are kept on the file. And the other issue that we find crops up regularly is the calibration of equipment. In a number of claims, the issue has arisen that the surveyor can't prove that they had their equipment properly calibrated. So it's very important that you do comply with the requirements for calibration, and that also you keep evidence of that somewhere in your computer or the documents to prove that you've actually calibrated the equipment that you've used. Now, with regards to photographs, people don't put in photographs in pre-purchase surveys. They do generally for perhaps other areas if you're reporting to a client, maybe an insurance company, and they want to see photographs, perhaps because of repairs are needed, or it may be a survey that's required by them. Always make sure you keep all the photographs, even the ones that you don't send to people. And I think Paul will agree with me here after various discussions. It's not good to put photographs in pre-purchase surveys, reports, because if you've missed anything in the photograph, then that can be pointed out to you as a deficiency in your report. So keep your photographs, proof of what you've done, save them on the system, keep them safe. And don't forget to back your systems up as well. That's one thing that's occurred more recently, is that people are not keeping backups of their systems. So make sure you've got good backups. And if you're going to do your own backup and not keep it in the cloud, make sure you check that your backups have not failed. So you should really have 2 backups every time, just in case one of the backup disks has failed. People find that there are problems sometimes in undertaking surveys, and you should make it quite clear any problems that have cropped up and make it perfectly clear as to the consequences that these problems have caused in you providing advice. We've had issues where vessels have not been propped up sufficiently for surveyors to get underneath. There's always the constant problem, particularly with the older vessels, with the amount of blackening on the outside and when they're not cleaned off. And all of these should be noted. And many people won't undertake the surveys that obviously boats are not cleaned. The other issues that should be raised are issues such as if the boat has just been recently taken out of the water and you wouldn't normally do the survey within that time period, something, you know, do you want it drier, or if it's been specifically wet, you must make clear comments regarding that in your reports. And recommendations and identifying other possible investigations. This is an area that is cropping up quite regularly, where surveyors are identifying potential problems, but they're not addressing clear enough for the client as to what other possible investigations should be undertaken pre-purchasing the vessel, or even perhaps before other repairs are undertaken. And this is leading to a lot of costs that are not envisaged by purchasers and owners of vessels before undertaking work. So do make sure that when you actually write that you clearly identify the possible investigations that are needed, and going on from that, suggestion of obtaining perhaps costs, so that the person who's purchasing is going to have an idea of what those costs will be in for undertaking investigations and possibly repair as well. So I'm not going to go through points 1, 2, 5 and 6 because we've generally dealt with those, and I'd like to focus on 2 of the areas that are probably cropping up more frequently, and those arising from 3 and 7 that I've mentioned. So always state the reason why you won't be commenting and why. Make it absolutely clear. As I said, if you're going to refer to your own terms and conditions, then do so, or whether there's also an access problem which is in your terms and conditions, on what you can't remove and why, and what possibly may be behind there, what may need to be looked at if you might know what's there. But we're having more complaints arising from conditions of furnishings and the costs of replacing things like mattresses that are stained, and when the boats are not cleaned properly, so you can't actually get in to look at certain areas. The engines, people commenting on the engines. A couple of times we've come across comments regarding the condition of the engine without making it absolutely clear that they're not saying the engine is fully functional. But it's just not clear from the report. They statements like it appears to be in good condition without confirming what they actually mean by good condition, without going on to make sure it's perfectly clear that it's external. They perhaps can't see any oil leaks if they want to make comments regarding that. And people are assuming that good condition is what it is, that it's in good running order. But that is not the point of the comment. The surveyor is only there to generally look, unless they decide, and they are an engineer, and they decide to actually go on and to actually look at and to consider the condition of the engine in more detail. We've had a couple of claims arising from radar systems not working properly, and it's really come down to the phraseology in the report and what's being expected of the surveyor. So the best thing to do, which we'll go on to take a look at, is to really just comment that you're just doing a switch test, and that the actual electronics is not tested itself for the purposes of fully functioning. And having spoken to Paul Homer, he uses a wonderful phrase which I do have and can give to people, but Paul can no doubt as well, regarding what should be put in reports for this switch testing. Now, gas is another area, particularly regarding stoves. Do make it quite clear that you're not checking gas unless you intend to actually check any gas appliances. And obviously your recommendations that flow from that for checks that you would suggest are undertaken. Areas that you can't access, the phraseology of what is accessible is very important, particularly in your terms and conditions and referring to your terms and conditions. If you're going to refer to your terms and conditions, always quote exactly what is in your terms and conditions in your reports. Don't vary the content of what is in the phraseology in your terms and conditions. Just repeat it in your report. And if you're going to say not accessible, always make sure it's quite clear why you're stating it's not accessible, because you're not going to be opening anything up. You won't be using a physical screwdriver, and make sure that's clear in your terms and conditions. So probably a catch-all at the end is always stating what's outside your remit, your scope, and of course your expertise. And do make sure that it's quite clear and it reflects what you're putting in any contractual terms. So I've just mentioned some of these already. The condition of furnishings, stain curtains and mattresses seem to be getting more expensive. And if you're doing a small survey for £500 or £600, then you're finding that the cost of stain curtains and mattresses claimed are substantially more than probably you're paid for the actual survey. I said engine and gearbox failure. We've had a lot of people that do not seem to realise that when you buy a boat, it's like buying a car. Unless it's given a guarantee, from the moment you purchase it, unless there's any obvious defect in the engine or gearbox, it could literally fail the next day. And these points need to be made clear, because we've had a number of gearbox failures where people have complained that the surveyor should have told them that there's a possibility that it will fail, or could fail, not will fail, but could fail the next day. So again, it needs to be perfectly clear in the report that you're only surveying and your comments are only relevant on that day. And if you have tested, obviously, that it works and it's running, do make it clear in however you intend to phrase it, that although you've tested today, tomorrow, there's no guarantees that there's not going to be failure. Radar systems is exactly the same. I mentioned about switch testing, the gas, the stoves, etc. I've mentioned already, so I won't go over that again. And areas that you can't access. We've had a number of issues to do with water supplies and the routing of water not being correctly routed in some vessels. I can't remember the exact details, but they did become potentially quite expensive claims. And it was areas that were not accessed because you couldn't access them without unscrewing or unbolting. And that's why I always say make sure that you do state quite clearly what you're not testing and what you can't access, and obviously suggest what further investigations they may possibly wish to consider and why. And as I've said about areas outside your remit, the scope of your expertise, just make sure that these are perfectly clear in your report, particularly regarding engines and cost of repairs, because you're not there unless you actually know what the cost of repairs are going to be, and you can give a really good estimate. Then that's something normally which wouldn't be within your specific expertise. And so you probably, and I would suggest, would be pointing them towards boat repairers, etc., to get a costing on repairs. So the question I always say to people: do you place all the necessary recommendations in your report, and do you always identify when possible investigations are required? We've come across this a number of times now, where surveyors are very good at identifying where there could be a problem, but they're not going on sufficiently to explain what types of investigations should be considered. And this it comes hand in hand really with the understanding, controlling your client's expectations. So I'm just going to go through one of the more recent scenarios, which I've combined with a couple of other issues that I want to talk about, just to speak about what we've had recently cropping up in terms of complaints which have turned into claims. So in this example, the surveyor completes his survey on a vessel that's not been out of the water long and the hull was not cleaned. There was no reference in the survey report to the fact the hull was not cleaned before survey and the problems associated with not having it cleaned. In that respect, it was obviously actually investigating the condition of the vessel and the readings that were taken. There were a few thinner areas of the hull that were found, but the condition of the hull made it, as I said, difficult to assess. The survey suggested removal of the blackening, but did not explain the process of providing clear recommendations as to the importance of undertaking the cleaning and checking of the hull as soon as possible. So what I will go on to discuss is the fact that when you're dealing with people that are purchasing vessels or any item, you have to assume that they do not know anything about what you're talking about in your report. So you have to go right back to basics. And that's the same for any profession. You should do, just to make sure that your client understands what you are saying and what the implications are and what your recommendations or suggestions are. So just using the phraseology, removal of the blackening, that wasn't clearly understood in this case, which I've mentioned further on, about what really needs to be done. And the person purchasing assumed it was just going to be a very cheap job of slapping some more paint over the top, which was not the case. And in the survey, there was no point to the potential purchaser to suggest they might wish to check the potential cost of cleaning alone and the repairs and blackening of the hull before purchasing. So the complaint was that the survey did not make the process clear that needed to be done, and nor the urgency, nor did the survey suggest that the prospective purchaser should perhaps consider getting a costing before purchase. As I said, the client thought that blackening just meant repainting the hull, which they thought was nothing much to do. In one of the cases, the surveyor was very lucky because the client in question had, I think within a few months, taken the vessel to be cleaned off and to be treated. And it was just unfortunate that the treatment wasn't done correctly. And in that case, that broke the chain of causation, and therefore the liability rested with the yard that was undertaking the cleaning the vessel's hull, because in theory they should have identified if there was going to be any substantial problems with the hull before they continued with the process of I think blackening the hull in that case. And the other point was that the actual work that was done didn't last a sufficient period of time, which suggested it hadn't been done correctly. So in that case, the surveyor was very lucky in the fact that there was a breaking in the chain of causation. Many surveyors I know wouldn't have undertaken the survey. They would have taken one look and said, no, it's not cleaned off sufficiently, or put it as a requirement in their terms of engagement that it had to be cleaned off. There was another problem which had arisen as well. I think it wasn't propped up correctly, so it was very difficult to get underneath to take a good look on top of all the grime, etc., that was on the outside. So in terms of this scenario, you should think very carefully what you should include in the content of the report. And as I've said, in many cases, I know some of the surveyors wouldn't actually undertake the survey even if they turned up, because they'd probably require that the vessel is cleaned off to a certain condition that they feel is suitable for undertaking the survey. So the other area of interest is comments. Sorry, I haven't skipped one. Is comments after the report has been done. We've had a number of claims that have not emanated specifically from the reports that are written, but it's been from the comments that have been included in emails afterwards to clients when they've asked for further information, or just generally additional questions that they feel that they wanted specific answers to. And I think this is when surveyors tend to let their guard down, because they find that that they're drawn into this sense of casual writing instead of continuing in the vein of being a professional person giving professional advice. And by writing in a more casual manner, they're frequently not referring back to their original report, and therefore the phraseology in their emails can be quite different and have it can be quite different and therefore perhaps provide the client with a different view of what they're purchasing. I'm just going to try and think of a couple of examples as I go through. So the recommendation is, when you write back to anybody, always write back as if you're providing an addendum to your report. Don't write casually. Write in a manner that you would do as if you were writing your report. And always reread your report and refer to the sections that you may be touching on, or things that are going to be expanded on. So, basically, when you're writing, as I said, the additional information, do make sure that you keep the language in a form that you would normally write. So we have had incidents where surveyors have written to a client answering queries after the report has been released, and those additional comments have been written, as I said, less formally. And as a consequence, they've modified the comments in the original survey report. And in one extreme case, the number of comments that were made led to allegations that the original report was completely defective and that the surveyor wasn't capable of doing their job, because the information in the email appeared to be contradictory to the information in the report, and nothing was given to suggest why there was a difference. So always make sure you explain clearly why you may have changed your mind. If you decide to change your mind about a point, or if you're expanding on a point, why it is just the case, and why it reinforces the point you have made in your report. So the important issue is linking any new comments you make with the points you have made in your report. If the report is silent on a point that has been raised by the client after the client has received the report, then state clearly why you did not comment on it in the report. It may not be something which was in your scope, and you may be confirming again that you can't comment on it, or it may be that something which wasn't identified to you as being that important at the time, but now it's being raised by the client, and then you can make comments to say that this wasn't an issue that was raised initially regarding X, Y, and Z, but now it's being raised. You would deal with it in more detail, and this is an addendum to your report, based on the fact of the query that's been raised and brought to your attention. So always make sure it's quite clear why you're making any comments, and what effect, if any, they're going to have on your original report. So I think some of the tips that I would put as important. I mean, there's so many. I could write pages on it. So I've just drawn here together those that I think have been cropping up more frequently, and areas that I think would assist if they're followed by particularly new surveyors in particular, that tend to skip. I consider they're probably skipping areas and points that they should be addressing. So I say use a checklist, templates and flowcharts. Flowcharts, I think, are excellent reminders of what you should be looking at. And I would use the flowcharts for every comment that you make when you've identified a specific point in terms of where there could be repairs or needing further investigations. So if you have, for example, a flowchart which identifies what might be wrong with the vessel, then if it follows down and then identifies what you could potentially be needing to look at next, for example, the further investigations, you might want to go and to specify in more detail if it's something which you know more about and you feel competent in doing so. But also make sure that you've identified the costings as well, the actual not you identify, but identify areas where the costings need to be possibly looked at, particularly if an individual is buying on a very tight budget. Always, I said, always leave reports and reread later. And I always say, when you reread your reports, always pretend you are someone who knows nothing about the subject when you're actually reviewing it, and perhaps give it to somebody else to read, your partner. And I think this is important because they'll probably pick up areas that you may miss because of your professional knowledge and experience. So again, I've mentioned this already, review all your recommendations and suggested further investigations to ensure they're clear and concise. Make sure that the individual will understand what you're saying in recommendations and suggested further investigations, because many people don't use terminology that's not defined. people say, oh, somebody will know what blackening is. Well, they don't understand the process, so make sure it's quite clear of the fact that the process will mean cleaning off, doing X, Y, and Z, if you know what the process is going to be. Alternatively, refer them, if you want to refer them to somebody. Alternatively, which is I would say as a recommendation, is to tell them that they should seek further investigations, perhaps with a repair shop, and just to find out what the cost would be in undertaking the repairs, or just the general cost of the investigation alone. So finally, always ensure you check the reasons for the purchase of any vessel and who is buying the vessel, and relying on your advice. I say this because there's been a number of instances where people do not know the reason for the purchase of the vessel, and it's transpired that they intended to make changes to a vessel, and then they find out they can't, or the cost of changing is excessive, and they then blame the surveyor. And often it's arisen because there's been some casual comment during a conversation, or alternatively they've been unclear as to what their reasons for purchase are. We've had a number of vessels that have been bought that have not been suitable for taking out in certain situations. For example, they may have been bought in Scotland and then taken all the way around the UK, but their hulls are not really perhaps fit. I'm not going to say not fit for purpose, but it wasn't the anticipation that they were going to undertake such force, and as a result of the movement of the vessels around the UK. So you really need to know what you're dealing with, and whether the vessel is going to be suitable for undertaking the distances, if they are going to undertake distances. So that's very important. And Paul and I have come across a number of vessels whereby they've been used and probably weren't suitable for undertaking the journeys. So anyway, that is my disclaimer as normal, Mike, and I hope you found the points that I've raised of interest, and just to give you some food for thought, and particularly those who are new to the area of surveying. I think it's very important that you firstly use the flowchart, and secondly you do reread the report as if you're reading it and you know nothing about the subject. And I think thirdly, to make sure that you've covered all stages, from identifying what the problem is to making it absolutely clear what any future action should be taken, and explaining it, and don't use a terminology that won't be understood by a layperson who has no knowledge of vessels at all, or wouldn't understand what they mean in terms of repair. So, but anyway, thank you very much, Mike. Appreciate it, and I hope that was of interest.
Karen, an insightful presentation as always. Lots of food for thought there. We always keep coming back to report writing. It's a subject that, although I know it gets quite tedious and dull and boring, it is 50% really of what a surveyor does as by way of output.
Yes.
50% doing the survey and 50% then writing it up. And I think it's absolutely invaluable to hear from you. You are looking at all of these things, seeing what's going wrong. So yes, hugely valuable. I do have one question that's coming from Barney. Again, if anyone else wants to fire a question in, we've got a few minutes. Barney says his standard phrase at first conversation and meeting with a client for a pre-purchase survey is that my job is to establish if the vessel is fundamentally as described, as a way of limiting the client's expectations. How do you think that fits?
I think that's a very good starting point. Yes, because that is what the purpose is normally. I would just caveat that, because we've if there's any inference that information has been given to a person as to what it's going to be used for, then that could be used as a cause of action by saying, well, the surveyor knew what I was going to use it for, what I was going to purchase it for. And although it fits the specifications and what would be expected of the vessel, the surveyor didn't go on to explain that it wouldn't be suitable to be used in certain conditions. We've had a number of these arguments where people have purchased vessels. There was one in particular that I remember many years ago, and unfortunately the gentleman in question, the surveyor, has now passed away, very sadly. But one lovely Saturday morning, I trundled off to part of the Kent coast to take a look at an issue with a vessel that had been purchased by two individuals, man and wife, that they intended to use and to convert, which was part of the problem, convert into a vessel to live on. Well, it transpired that this vessel, which had been clearly identified, nothing wrong with what the survey did, absolutely nothing at all, had been identified as having a very, very, I think it was 2 mil thick actually from memory, very thin hull. And the reason why was it had been made for the purposes of the film industry, strangely enough. And it wasn't a requirement that over the whole vessel it had 4 millimetre. I think it just had 2 millimetre at one point, where you wouldn't normally have 2 millimetres. And although it didn't make it not seaworthy, it certainly wasn't going to be up to undertaking certain, or not, it couldn't withstand certain weather. But there were a number of issues that arose from that. One was the expectations of what they could do with it, because the thinness of the vessel caused a welding problem as well, and I think the type of metal used as well from memory. And although that wasn't, and it was dealt with actually quite clearly in the reports, so there was no negligence of the surveyor at all, no problem at all with what he had done. But I think now, as time has gone on, because that was nearly 10 years ago, and I think because of the way judgments are changing, I think that could become a problem, because particularly if an individual who was undertaking the survey knew what it was going to be used for, and that welding may have to be undertaken, there's possibly a clearer recommendation should the vessel have been surveyed pre-purchase. This wasn't a pre-purchase survey, I might add. They bought it before they had it surveyed, which was one of the issues that the purchasers tried to reverse in the in the report, but it had made it quite clear that it was post-purchase survey, so that clarified it. But if it had been a pre-purchase survey, I think it would have been vitally important to clearly draw it to the attention, this problem with the thinness, and possibly doing any work on it, and therefore to get it checked out beforehand, because there was tremendous problems with welding the hull to make it waterproof again, because the metal was basically just the welding was making holes in the metal.
Karen, so I've got two questions that roll into one, perhaps to bring the session to an end, if I may. So Mike Chadwick says, I'm concerned that responsibility for affordability is being moved on to surveyors. Timro agrees, quite so. I think this is a broker problem, encouraging people to buy at a level they cannot afford. Buying the boat is only the starting point for the expenses. Quite a problem with motorboats in the 50 to 70 foot range, he says. Any comments on that?
I totally agree with him. I totally agree with him. I think insurers should go after the sales brokers more, and I think there should be more responsibility on the sales broker. And I think there's also more of a problem for surveyors when they almost get their instructions, and again comes back to knowing your client and making it perfectly clear who's instructing you, and making sure that that if you're instructed, well, not instructed, but if you're contacted by the sales broker, that it's clear when you're dealing with the client, the fact that your scope of work, as was mentioned before, is only checking the specifications and obviously usage, which may affect what is given as advice, and make it quite clear that the responsibility of the sales broker versus your responsibility. If you don't feel comfortable because of your relationship with the broker, which I can understand, sales broker, then at least make it clear when you're speaking to the individual that anything that was expected to be with the vessel that they've been told by the sales broker, you know, is their responsibility to check out.